what's the future from the trade union movement's point of view, it's not a bright one.
Peter Reith should know. He's poised to present to Parliament the draft of legislation that will radically undermine the power of unions in Australia.
Well, this piece of legislation is certainly the most substantial attack on the rights of workers and organised labour that this nation has seen. There's no doubt about that.
Tonight on Four Corners, we preview the Reith reforms and ask if the union movement can survive the challenge of the new era. Behind the Eureka Stockade flag lives the man John Howard has described as the voice of the future of industrial relations in Australia. It's 7 in the morning and Mal Loftus is off to work at CRA's giant bauxite mine in Weipa. Mal's one of the workers lured by CRA to abandon his union and collective bargaining and sign an individual contract. At the height of the Weipa dispute at the end of last year, when the unions brought the nation to a standstill, Mal went on the radio to sing the praises of the new system.
And I've never forgotten the interview he gave on early morning radio in which he spoke of the change that had come over his attitude towards his employment after he had signed the contract, of how his contribution to the company was valued more highly as a result, of how he felt he was making a contribution to the future of the company, and how his whole attitude to his work and to his job and to his responsibilities had altered. And when I listened to that truck driver at Weipa, I reflected to myself that I was listening to the voice of the future.
When you took the individual contract, you left the union?
Yes.
Why?
Well, if you actually join the company, then you've made the paradigm shift and joined the company, taken on the trust and love and all the other great ideals. I've had a really good look at the fair treatment system, and it is seen to be operating as expected. So I don't know what I need the union for anymore, really, in my own personal life.
That voice is being heard in virtually every major company in Australia already today, and has been for a number of years. The idea of this one-on-one relationship is unquestionably the way in which industrial relations is going to go in the future. And the reason is that there's a lot of pressure on those who are paying wages to have as good and cooperative and harmonious relationship they can with the people with whom they work. And so that's good for both sides. That genuinely is a win-win situation. So yes, I think we'll see more of it.
What Peter Reith is predicting, for better or for worse, is the end of the collectivist era in Australia. This workplace is Reith's model for change, and Greg Walker from CRA is proud of it.
The new government has indicated that in part it's been inspired to make some of those changes as a result of what they've seen happening here, the improvements in productivity and worker satisfaction. So certainly we would support those changes that are based on our own good experience, and we would hope that in fact other people in Australia will benefit.
What are we up to? We've almost got these pumps back in.
What the new government has seen at Weipa is the growth of individual contracts, the decline of collective bargaining and the collapse of union membership. And this has all happened under a Labor government. The fear for the union movement is that under Reith's new law, the move to individualism is encouraged and entrenched.
Well, I think Weipa is probably a microcosm of the big picture that Mr. Reith would really want at the end of the day. It's the antithesis to collective bargaining and workers working together for outcomes. I mean, the system is all about undermining collectivism, promoting individualism, hoping to get rid of unions, and in this case by a sophisticated strategy of buying them out of their beliefs. And we were very lucky that we had people there who were prepared to resist that.
The issues that we went on strike over...
These are the workers who were prepared to resist, a small minority of the Weipa workforce. For over 2 years, they doggedly stood by their union, while the contract workers doing the same job earned thousands of dollars more. Over time, their number dwindled.
In your case, why didn't you take the contract?
Because I didn't want to give up my right to collectively bargain. I felt that to bargain with CRA, that I would be much better off in a collective, because let's face it, CRA is a large organisation, there's a lot of resources, and on my side of the fence, if I'd have taken a contract, it would have just been myself. I feel that with the support of the union movement and my colleagues, we would have a much better chance of negotiating a reasonable remuneration.
Why should workers believe that a huge, rich, multinational company will look after an individual's interest?
Well, I think it comes down to a question of trust. I mean, we're talking about a system which is fundamentally based on trust.
Well, your company said that they're going to abide by it and they're reneging on their own words. Why should we go to commission every time?
And the workers are back on strike. These men have little reason to take CRA on trust. In January, the Industrial Relations Commission found the company denied them pay rises simply because they chose to negotiate through their union.
No, we're getting nothing out of this. All we're doing is just media coverage now, yes, but...
Did people see it as an irony that you say, I stayed with the union because I thought I'd get a better outcome, when everybody who left got a better outcome?
No, I don't, because now I have not compromised my principles or prostituted myself. I now have the right to union representation, the right to collectively bargain, the same remuneration and conditions as people on contract, and 2 years back pay, so I'm fully vindicated in my decision.
Well, I wouldn't go and sell our achievements too short just at the moment, because we've achieved quite a fair bit. Remember back on
the strike flared up again when CRA insisted that these workers all put an individual signature on the improved terms of employment the company was ordered to offer them. The men insisted that the union could accept on their behalf. It could seem petty on both sides, but it's the heart of the whole dispute, the right of workers to be represented by their union. Within a matter of days, CRA backed off.
In a sense, what have you gained in that you're now on the same wages and conditions as those people who took individual contracts?
No, I still have the right now to have union representation. We can still collectively vary those contracts if we ever get a 50% plus one on site.
The chances of these men ever getting 50% of their fellow workers back in the union would have to be at best remote. They're now down to around 10% of the workforce. And there's a potential new hurdle. According to the present draft of the new legislation, companies will be able to refuse to negotiate agreements with the union as a party, no matter how many of their workers are in the union. And for the first time in the federal system, individual contracts will override collective bargaining.
It's one of the most significant steps that we'll see in this country for a long time. It is a break from the past of collectivism, which is the whole basis of the present industrial relations system.
The spirit of the new law echoes the philosophy of CRA. You can trust yourself and your employer to strike the best deal.
It remains to be seen whether at the end of the day, whether this trust that CRA talk about actually delivers what they hope it to deliver.
Well, at present it's delivering a lot more money.
It's delivering a lot more money to individuals, yes. Yeah.
I've got to admit, at my age, it was a monetary decision. It wasn't for anything else. My pay increased quite considerably, so yeah, I didn't even hesitate.
CRA wants to buy more than just a signature on a contract. They're investing time and money into changing the workplace culture.
OK, team.
These workers are all on individual contracts.
We've been given a task here this afternoon. We have to organise this length of rope into a square.
Part of the deal is that they're expected to participate in programs like this. They're blindfolded and set a task. The workers must rely on leadership, which in the company's words, will act fairly and with courage. They must learn trust in a situation of fear.
One of the aims of this course is to try to get the workforce to understand where the company's trying to go with all of this cultural change. The idea that I have in mind, if they follow through, it'll be great. It will be good.
Do you think there's room in that culture you're describing, that new culture, for the union?
Don't need them.
The way that we operate our systems here in Weipa is that we wish to operate them directly with the people that work for us. What we don't want to have is a situation of having third parties involved in the operation of staff systems.
And that third party is the union?
Is the union movement, yes.
12, 13, 14.
As people have gone on to the contract, what do you feel about the stand that's been taken by those union members who've stayed on the award?
Oh my God, nearly ran into a tree.
I respect what they're doing and they're right to do it, but I don't really understand what they're on about.
And Gary?
Well, yeah, I do. I respect what they've got, and I think that anybody who fights for what they believe in deserves a pat on the back.
Okay, one.
Maybe down the track everybody will find out that the company isn't out to screw them all the time. And they've never screwed me in any way, so I'm quite happy.
But what do you think is the fundamental issue that this dispute is about?
Trust in the
Survival of unionism at the end of the day.
Yeah?
I mean, if this goes across the nation over time, where are the unions going to be? If they're not needed, they don't have a function.
The culture of business in Australia is changing, and with that, the culture of unions also have to change. And maybe this is a point where the unions are looking at themselves. I mean, obviously they're looking at their future, and maybe they're reassessing how they are going to contribute to the workplace in Australia.
It's almost a square. Thank you, team. I've been here, as I said, a number of years, and I've been in the union almost all of that time, and I don't think they've been properly looking after the interests of their members. And when it came to the crunch, their members said, "See you later, Jack. I'm going to go with my employer."
Well, I'm sad if that's the view of the workers, but if that's the view, then the union movement can't close its ears to those views.
But it's not just Weipa, is it? It's Weipa, it's Hammersley, it's Bell Bay, it's not just CRA. They're all now on individual contracts.
True, but could it be because at the time that those contracts were being offered, the workers didn't have sufficient faith in the ability of the union movement at that time to deliver them a comparable outcome?
Probably,
I mean, might it be that reason?
And might that be true?
Well, it may well have been true if that was the view that motivated them taking contracts.
What does it say about the strength of the union movement that it was unable, though, to offer its own members the same, let alone better, pay and condition than non-union members?
Well, I don't know the extent to which the unions pursued a collective claim on the company to match exactly the conditions of employment under the contract. I wasn't around then.
Local unionists who were around blame union inaction and union rivalries.
The unions could have been a lot more proactive through the processes of the Accord, tempered with common sense, and they wouldn't have been in a position to let CRA get the jump on them. There was a lot of, with this amalgamation of unions, there's a lot of internal fighting there, which was inevitable that some unions would self-destruct, and unions are still now, after having lost sites, are still fighting with each other, and they'd sooner fight with each other than look after their members.
Some of the unionists in Weipa put it to us that it was inter-union struggles that allowed CRA to get the jump on the unions.
Well, certainly the workers at Weipa would be closer in terms of their analysis. But at the end of the day, we've just got to ensure that whatever differences exist between us, be they within unions or in the broader movement, that they are very much subsidiary to the main task. Otherwise, we lose sight of the fact that we should all be fighting the common enemy in terms of the new government, rather than amongst one another.
Jenny George, how are you? Already.
My first time on the feast.
How are the negotiations going? Have they started? And what is Peter Reith like to talk to?
I'll tell you later.
Oh, okay.
The ACTU is heading into the first of a series of meetings with the common enemy. 2 weeks after the election.
Good luck ACTU.
There's a big agenda. The government has foreshadowed a major shake-up of the system, narrowing the scope of awards, reducing the role of the Industrial Relations Commission, increasing the scope for non-union agreements, toughening up the bans on secondary boycotts, abolishing preference clauses and closed shops, facilitating the growth of enterprise unions, and the list goes on and on. Everyone's a little tense. The new minister is keen to put the parties at ease, and no one wants to look like they're picking a fight.
Nice haircut, too. What about the suit?
As the weeks have passed and the meetings have continued, there's been little joy for the ACTU. Are you finding much common ground with Peter Reith?
No, very little at all. I mean, we're coming from quite different ideological and political perspectives. Put simply, I believe in protection for workers, in the established conventions of the system as we've known them for the last 100 years. He believes in deregulation of the labour market and letting market forces determine the outcomes. So when you're that far apart on basic philosophical issues, it will be hard to find common ground.
Are you optimistic that the union movement will survive as a real force in Australia?
Well, to me, it's not a matter of optimism. I mean, I just say the future is in their own hands. I'm not trying to dictate it. What's happened, though, is that trade unions in Australia have been propped up by legislative decree from Canberra. They've been given a helping hand legislatively from the previous government. Now, we're obviously going to remove that. We remove the crutches, if I can mix my metaphors, so they've got to stand on their own 2 feet. How they survive is entirely up to them.
Is your legislation going to give them a slap in the face?
Well, it's not aimed at getting into the unions. I mean, we certainly think that they've had far too much influence, particularly for those people who are non-union members.
But it will hurt them in that you will refuse them access to look at the kinds of conditions that have been negotiated in workplaces in which they don't have members. You will abolish preference clauses. You will make it possible to deregister a union if they go against the kinds of orders that are handed out by the Industrial Relations Commission. I mean, all those will hurt the unions, won't they?
Well, take preference. I mean, I think it's just a basic, civil right for people to be treated on their merits. And I don't see why people should be discriminated against because they choose not to be a member of a union. Now, you can say, oh, that's going to hurt the unions. Well, I must say my interest is in the interest of the worker. It's not in some union boss who's been squeezing, $5 a week out of some person who doesn't want to be in a union. Now, let's look at this on the basis of what is in the interest of the rights of individuals, not in the interest of someone who's just creaming off, a few dollars for their own benefit.
It's a day of union solidarity on the picket line at the gates of the Vickery coal mine in New South Wales. It's the longest running strike in Australia since 1919. The miners here see preference clauses from a different perspective.
There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. It all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in our union. Now the lessons of...
At the heart of this dispute is the preference clause in their award, which has effectively delivered these workers a closed shop. When jobs come up, it obliges the company to give preference to retrenched miners first and then to union members. This is the kind of clause which Reith will abolish. A busload of Queensland miners have driven down south to show their solidarity. They're well aware there's more at stake than just what happens at this one mine. There's a new government in town.
It's a very good bus driver.
I think the traditional militancy of the coal mining unions, along with the waterfront workers, puts us in the forefront of Howard's sights. I've got no doubt about that. We'll destroy our preference of unionism. We'll stop people being able to collect union dues at the pay office and generally make it difficult for the union to make sure that industries are unionised. With the decline of members in the industry that are unionised, it's easier to bring in individual contracts such as the Weipa people put up with.
The Vickery coal mine is owned by Novacoal, a subsidiary of CRA. It's been losing money from the day it opened back in 1991. The company is determined to break the closed shop and to introduce 12-hour shifts. The miners' union is standing solid on both these fronts. It's a deadlock.
I want to employ the best person for the job, and I don't want to be restricted to just a union list.
You want the capacity to employ people who are in the union or not in the union?
Yes.
Where that preference clause is not there, it seems to me that unionism is diminishing fast, and that's the real worry that I've got. You know, we're proud of our position, like the Wharfies have been totally unionised, and we want to maintain that.
Hey! It's night shift on the picket line, which has now been manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for over 9 months. CRA has asked the Industrial Relations Commission to arbitrate in this intractable dispute, to let the umpire decide. Ironically, some of the Queensland miners who've come to show support already work the 12-hour shifts. But there's not much talk about that inside the tent. It's union solidarity. What's your feeling about the way things will change now there's a new government?
I'm a little bit worried at the moment.
Especially if they turn around and say to people that you don't have to be in the unions anymore.
The thing I'm worried about with people who will not pay union dues is that if anything happens to them, they're going to expect those of us who do pay union dues to fight for them. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not on.
Nothing's ever been given to unionists. They've always had to fight for everything they got. And it's not right that these people should expect to come into the industry without paying their dues and come in on the same wicket.
Why is the company so keen to win this one?
Well, I think they thought if they could get a win here, just be able to flow on to the rest of their mines in different areas. But we are 100% against working 12-hour shifts. I don't want to spend the rest of my life working for this company 12-hour shifts and not getting to enjoy the rest of my life. You've got to be able to live as you work.
We've got to show we're strong together, and we stand together and we fall together.
And we're glad to have them here. Yeah.
The Industrial Relations Commission made its ruling 12 days ago. The workers were ordered to try out the 12-hour shifts. But CRA lost its bid to get rid of the preference clause. The Commission held that it didn't stop the company employing suitable labour. The strike continues.
Look, preference clauses, compulsory unionism, that's a relic from the turn of the century, when the idea was to have a centralised scheme, when everybody would be in the scheme, where unions would represent all the workers and employer organisations would represent all the employers, and basically, whether you liked it or not, for the good of the system, everybody was in the system. Now, the world has changed.
Labour Day, 1912. From these early days up to the 1950s, union membership was on the rise. At its peak, over 50% of the Australian workforce was in a union. The unions gained their strength on the back of their entrenched position in the compulsory system of arbitration and conciliation established at the turn of the century. The idea was that a centralised system with an umpire delivered a fair go for workers, whose position would otherwise always be weaker than their boss. Awards were the expression of that fair go. The system was vigorously opposed by the free marketeers of the time. In recent years, the modern industrial umpire, the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, has been right to feel a little unwanted. Under the Labor government, its influence waned. The idea of an institution which acts as a central umpire in industrial relations is uniquely Australian. Over the years, this system has copped a lot of abuse from both employers and unions, that it's outdated, self-serving and inflexible. But its supporters argue it's part of what gives Australia our egalitarian ethos. The Australian Industrial Relations Commission will survive the Reith reform plan for now, but its powers will be greatly diminished.
First of all, in the area of non-union agreements, workplace agreements, the Commission has no role whatsoever. Secondly, in the area of the Commission settling disputes, it can no longer arbitrate to settle a dispute, except in the essential services. It can only conciliate. It can't force the parties to a settlement even when it thinks the bargain is unequal. The Commission has turned from an agency which controlled bargaining and fairness into little more than a minimum wage tribunal.
I mean, we have an industrial relations system that's developed in this country precisely because the law of contract was an unequal bargaining relationship. And what Mr. Reith's doing is trying to turn the clock back to the 1890s, before we had the Commission, before we had the awards.
What's more important? The people, you know, the workers, or those who are functionaries in the system? I mean, the system was set up to serve the people, not the other way around. This is not an institution which is to have a life of its own, regardless of the consequences for individual Australians.
In the last 5 years under Labor, the central importance of the Commission's award-setting role had already diminished through enterprise bargaining. Its decline will continue under Reith's plan as the terms of awards are stripped back to 20 basic conditions laid out in the legislation. The conditions that fall by the wayside will have to be bargained for.
The economic reason for that, the justification for that is, as has been recognised really by both sides of politics in Australia, is that if you have a more flexible system like that, you'll have terms and conditions at work which more reflect the circumstances of our businesses. Now, I know that's a bit jargonistic in a sense, but what it means is we're trying to tailor-make terms and conditions of employment to suit our businesses, whilst at the same time giving people a basic safety net of protection.
The Weipa dispute at the end of last year provides the most graphic example of the loss of the Commission's powers. Frustrated by their lack of progress, these striking workers blockaded Weipa Harbour. Miners and wharfies around the country walked off the job in solidarity. It was a national industrial crisis. Under the proposed new law, the IRC will no longer have the power to intervene in a dispute like this. It could not decide, as it did, that these workers had been discriminated against. It could not order CRA to pay them recompense. In the new era of industrial relations, it will now just be the power of the unions battling against the power of the company. And the government plans to take away the union movement's most powerful weapon, secondary boycotts, to toughen up the penalties on unions like the wharfies who strike in solidarity.
The fundamental benefits that we would see in changes to the legislation would be perhaps in the area of secondary boycotts, because we've obviously in the recent Weipa dispute, seen an example of people involved in the coalfields and also the waterfront who are not directly involved in this dispute being called out on strike, and we think that that's not a reasonable situation.
But what they also have to face is the real prospect that there won't be changes in the secondary boycott laws on the basis of the stated policy of the minority parties.
There won't be?
Well, they've got to face that real prospect. I mean, I think the Democrats' policy is that the secondary boycott provision should not be taken out of the arena of industrial relations and put back into the trade practices regime.
The fate of the whole industrial relations package rests with the Democrats. They hold the balance of power in the Senate. The big fight will come over the role of the Industrial Relations Commission. The Democrats' industrial relations policy states explicitly that they're opposed to any reduction of the power of the IRC. So will they block the legislation?
We have a clear mandate on that. So will they eventually? Well, I don't think they will. I mean, the Democrats went to the last election and said their number one promise was, they had all their ads on it, and that was, if you vote for the Democrats, we'll keep the bastards honest. Well, it's a pretty odd thing for the Democrats to say the first thing we'll do is we'll make the bastards break their promises, i.e. their industrial relations legislation.
But they've come out very clearly and very strongly since that, and they have said that we will protect the industrial umpire in Australia. We will stand firm on that.
Well, look, they say all sorts of things. I mean, if you can work out what they say from Martha, you know, that's fine.
What does it say about the strength of the union movement that you are now reliant on the Democrats, who have just a handful of seats in the Senate, to hold back the mandate of the Howard government?
Well, we certainly need to rely on the Democrats to remove the worst excesses of the legislation. But we can't rely on the Democrats or anybody else to ensure that we get on with the challenges and the tasks at hand for the union movement.
Newcastle, New South Wales, blue-collar Labor heartland. But in the last election, here as in the rest of the country, battlers swung to the coalition. The defeat of the Labor government was a humbling rejection of not just the Labor Party, but the Labor movement. The task at hand for the union movement is to understand why. Mary McGill is a local union official for the metalworkers.
Our strategy is that we have to get back out there with the grassroots and the membership. We have to listen to what issues they want us to be acting for on behalf of them, which our unions instructed us to do every day, and then bring together and formulate a position in relation to wages and conditions for our workers. What do you believe the union's not doing right as far as looking after the membership?
I think a lot of it is they're not sticking up for their members in a lot of cases. Where before the unions were very strong, I think they've lost a lot of power. They've given away too much. They've given away a lot of our conditions.
The last 13 years were the glory days of power and influence of the ACTU, thanks to the Accord. They delivered wage restraint in return for the social wage. But the rank and file here are unimpressed.
Today, in talking to our membership, some of them didn't even know who Bill Kelty or Jenny George were, so that gave me grave concerns. What sort of job do you believe Jenny George and Bill Kelty's doing?
I wouldn't have a clue what they're doing.
Right. And what about Kelty and Jenny George? Do you reckon they're doing a good job?
I don't even know who they are.
There was also one of our members that made the statement that he's pleased now that the Labor Party is out of power because now he believes Bill Kelty's a good leader, that he hasn't been there working for the ACTU and the trade union movement over the last few years, but more working with and for the Labor Party. You believe Kelty was working too much with the Labor government rather than doing his job
Most definitely,
as a trade union leader?
Yes.
I believe probably they haven't been involved enough in the grassroots issues that of the normal blue-collar rank and filers that we've traditionally looked after, and the working class people, and because they've been tied up probably more in the bureaucracy and the change of the system that's occurred.
Do you think in some ways the union movement suffered from the same problem as the Labor Party in that the leadership... Big picture, the leadership was felt to be out of touch. There was a sense of arrogance and we know best for you.
Well, gee, I hope they wouldn't perceive me to be arrogant or thinking I know best for people. But there was certainly, I think workers were saying, well, the big picture might be fine, but my little picture in my little house with my family is what matters most to me. And I think after 13 years in government, people do get a bit removed and remote from it.
How much of a major concern is it for the ACTU that in the private sector you now only represent 1 in 4 workers?
Enormous concern. I mean, if that trend continues, we are going down the route of historical irrelevancy in the private sector. So that is very worrying. I think it's areas like clerical, the agricultural sector, in particular, that caused me concern. I mean, the last lot of figures I looked at, the rates of unionisation in agriculture was probably down around 10-15%.
And the service sector must be very low.
The service sector.
What would that be
in
now?
the clerical, I would hazard a guess and say probably around 15 to 20%. So what I'm saying is that we've now got the historical opportunity to redress this decline in membership. It is a serious problem, and it's our number 1 challenge.
Comrades, I formally open the conference of Australian New Zealand Maritime and Stevedoring Unions.
The Maritime Union of Australia has invited a New Zealand comrade over for advice.
Thank you, Comrade Chair, comrades.
New Zealand presents the nightmare scenario for the trade unions in Australia.
There's a lot of scenarios emerging that are sickeningly familiar to the New Zealand unions.
4 years after the government there brought in similarly tough industrial reforms, the level of union membership fell by a dramatic 45%. Traditionally strong and militant unions like the Wharfies Union were decimated. The introduction of enterprise unions, non-union and casual labour broke their back. The Maritime Union here is determined that the same fate will not befall it. Confrontation appears inevitable.
There is a lot in our experience in the past few years that we believe we would be able to impart to you.
Surely any government would have the sense to sit down with the industry participants and sit down and work out what is going to be in the best interest of the industry and the people in it. And that's the way we would like to see it go.
But if they sit down with you and say, sure, the Maritime Union can exist, but we would also like to open up the waterfront to enterprise unions and indeed to non-union labour, can you work together on that?
No, we cannot. We will not and cannot.
But given that they are going to go ahead with those changes in the legislation, what will happen with the Maritime Union? When they go ahead with the abolition of closed shops, the abolition of preference clauses and the introduction of enterprise unions, what will happen?
If they pursue that particular line to do things in a confrontationist way, well then confrontation will be met by the unions collectively.
The trade union movement in this country, collectively, and the metal workers individually, owe a great debt to the maritime workers for the support that they have given to us over the years, and as a consequence, we ought to, in these circumstances, return that support, and we will.
And what are you preparing for in terms of that support? What do you expect?
In terms of the waterfront, one would hope for the best, but I'd have to expect the worst, and if the worst occurs, then you would have to expect that there will be blood on the waterfront.
Blood on the waterfront?
Blood on the waterfront.
How do you see that arising?
Oh, because I think the only way that the employers on the waterfront and this government can crush the waterside workers or the maritime workers is by bringing in the police and the troops. And if that occurs, then the trade union movement will rise to their defence vigorously.
Does it worry you that some unionists are predicting blood on the waterfront?
No. Sabre rattling is commonplace in Australian industrial relations. Now, I'm not saying that it's all going to be sweetness and light on the waterfront. No one in their right mind would say that. The waterfront unions have been pretty aggressive in the past. They They basically ran the last government on A&L, on waterfront reform, on a whole raft of significant issues, and we've had industrial strife there. But the idea, again, of a sort of World War III, I don't think's, I think it's completely overblown, put it that way.
Well, this piece of legislation is certainly the most substantial attack on the rights of workers and organised labour that this nation has seen. There's no doubt about that.
So will we get the full symphony?
Well, let's wait and see what happens between now and the passage, the ultimate passage of that legislation.
What's the worry? What's the worry? We have a mandate and we proceed to implement our mandate. Our worry ought to be the public backlash to us if we don't proceed with what we said we'd do.
It's 2 months after the election and time to dismantle Jenny George. The union movement is not in for an easy ride. For most of this century, their central position in our industrial relations system has been guaranteed. That's about to change. From now on, they know for their voice to be heard, they'll need to revive their grassroots base, reinvigorate their rank and file, and get more members. The outlook is grim, but the union leadership is putting on a brave face.
It's day one of a new era, as it were. The objective circumstances are there for unionism to grow and to thrive in this environment. And if we can't do it, if we're not up to meeting the challenge, we can't blame anyone else at the end of the day except ourselves.